Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation. Today, we'll be exploring a fascinating chapter of Cold War history, focusing on how access to West Berlin was managed and the challenges involved. Our journey will take us through the complexities of transit routes, the risks faced, and the strategic importance of those efforts. Let's get started. After 1945, Berlin was divided into 4 sectors, controlled by the US, British, French, and Soviet forces. The Western sectors, comprising the US, British, and French zones, formed West Berlin, which was actually deep inside East Germany, over 100 miles from West Germany itself. Because of this, transit into West Berlin depended heavily on Soviet approval, and there were 3 main land corridors, 1 rail corridor, and air corridors that connected West Berlin to West Germany. The Western Allies negotiated safer routes, especially for air travel. The air corridors, established from 1948 to the 1990s, were fixed routes controlled by Allied air traffic. During the Berlin Airlift of 1948 to 1949, these air corridors proved to be the safest option since the Soviets rarely risked direct conflict with Western aircraft. The Autobahn and rail transit routes also played a key role. They involved checkpoints, with Helmstedt, Marienborn being the most heavily used. Although these routes were heavily policed by East German border guards and Soviet troops, they operated under official agreements and predictable procedures, making them relatively reliable for transit. Now, let's consider the risks involved in crossing through the Soviet sector directly into West Berlin, bypassing these negotiated corridors. This was the riskiest route of all. Why? Because unlike the official Autobahn and air corridors, crossing through the Soviet-controlled sector meant placing yourself under direct Soviet military authority. This made your safety unpredictable. The Soviets often harassed, detained, or expelled those they considered suspicious, especially military personnel, journalists, or suspected smugglers. Furthermore, capturing Westerners in the Soviet sector provided the USSR with political leverage. It was a form of propaganda and a bargaining chip in Cold War politics. By the 1950s and 60s, East Germany's secret police, the Stasi, along with East German border guards, also closely monitored movement through this area. Any mistakes or acts of defiance could lead to interrogation, imprisonment, or forced repatriation. Finally, a key hotspot symbolizing this tense situation was Checkpoint Charlie. It became the focal point of risk, where the US and Soviet forces faced off at the crossing point. It represented the high-stakes nature of navigating the divided city and the constant threat of conflict and espionage that defined this period of Cold War Berlin. Here, travelers moving from West Berlin into East Berlin, and vice versa, entered what was known as the Soviet sector. This was a highly sensitive area, and tensions reached a boiling point in October 1961, when US and Soviet tanks faced off at Checkpoint Charlie. This standoff really underscored how crossing through the Soviet sector could escalate into a global crisis, highlighting just how dangerous and unpredictable it was. Now, why did people still take the risk? Well, for one, family ties played a big role. Many West Berliners crossed into East Berlin to visit relatives, maintaining crucial personal connections despite the risks. Spies and couriers also used these crossings as part of their covert operations. They needed to blend in with ordinary civilians to gather intelligence or deliver messages. And then there's curiosity and necessity. Journalists, diplomats, and business travelers often found themselves with no real choice but to cross through these Soviet-controlled areas, either to do their work or fulfill their responsibilities. To sum it up, the most dangerous route to West Berlin was actually trying to go through the Soviet sector itself, outside the official transit corridors. Unlike the agreed-upon air and Autobahn routes, crossing through the Soviet sector left travelers completely at the mercy of Soviet and East German authorities. That meant the risk of detention, propaganda, or worse, making it a zone of constant surveillance, tension, and potential flashpoints between East and West. They rarely treated the city, or the Western presence there, as normal or settled. Instead, the Soviet Union consistently tried to undermine Western legitimacy. They did this by placing restrictions, shifting rules, and forcing confrontations. A few examples really illustrate this pattern clearly. One key example is the Berlin Blockade of 1948 to 1949. When the Western Allies introduced a new currency, the Deutschmark, in West Berlin, the Soviets reacted strongly. They responded by blocking all road, rail, and canal access from West Germany into Berlin. Their main goal was to pressure the West into abandoning Berlin or accepting Soviet conditions. But the Western response was decisive. They launched the Berlin Airlift, which supplied the city with food, fuel, and other essentials for almost a year. This showed that the Soviets had to back down, but it also demonstrated their willingness to use Berlin as leverage to achieve their aims. This pattern of trying to chip away at Western influence through restrictions and confrontations was a recurring theme during this period. It highlights how tense and strategic the Cold War rivalry was, especially in key areas like Berlin. On this slide, we're looking at harassment on the corridors, and it's important to understand that even after formal agreements established the transit routes, Soviet and East German authorities often disrupted these efforts. They would frequently stop Allied convoys, sometimes demanding paperwork that wasn't even required by the treaty, or staging what appeared to be inspections. These actions weren't really about security. They were more about sending a message, reminding the West that Moscow could always disrupt access whenever it chose. Moving on to checkpoint politics, especially at places like Checkpoint Charlie, the guards imposed arbitrary rules, things like sudden ID checks, bans on specific goods, or delays that were designed to humiliate or intimidate. But these weren't just random acts of inconvenience. They served a political purpose. They were theatrical acts, a way of saying, "We control your ability to reach Berlin." It was all about asserting dominance and demonstrating control. Now, perhaps the most iconic example of this tense game was the Berlin Wall in 1961. East Germany, backed by the Soviets, sealed off East Berlin with barbed wire and concrete, slicing through streets and neighborhoods. Officially, they claimed it was to stop fascists from infiltrating, but in reality, it was about preventing East Germans from fleeing and asserting their sovereignty, showing that they could cut off the city and control its movement. Finally, we need to understand the concept of psychological warfare here. Every Soviet move in Berlin was carefully calculated to unsettle the Western powers. For example, stopping a convoy today might be followed by a message that, "Maybe tomorrow, you'll give up your claims." It was about showing the world that the West's presence in Berlin was only tolerated because Moscow allowed it. It wasn't just logistics or tactics. It was about undermining Western resolve without crossing into open war. And importantly, the Soviets deliberately avoided acting normal. Normalcy would have meant recognizing West Berlin's status as a Western outpost inside their sphere, which they refused to do. By keeping the tension alive, they hoped to eventually push the Allies out. It was a deliberate strategy, keeping the pressure on and the conflict ongoing. The weirdness of Berlin during the Cold War was never just about walls and tanks. It was also about rules within rules, creating a shadow world of spies, authority, and shifting recognition. Let's break that down a bit. First, spies everywhere. Berlin was essentially the spy capital of the Cold War. You had CIA, KGB, MI6, Stasi, French intelligence, all operating both openly and covertly. Why was that? Because the divided city provided perfect cover. You could live in one sector, cross into another, and pass along intelligence relatively easily. The Soviets used East Berlin as a kind of deniable playground. If a spy got caught there, they could claim it was just East German business, not theirs. Westerners even joked that in Berlin, every taxi driver works for somebody. It really shows how deep the spy game went. Now let's talk about rules as weapons. Transit rules, passport checks, access agreements. These weren't just bureaucratic hurdles. They were tools of policy, weapons in this strange chess game. A Soviet or East German guard might enforce the rules one day, then ignore them the next, creating uncertainty and leverage. For example, an Allied convoy had the right to pass freely without inspection, but Soviet officers might insist on counting the vehicles. Resisting could escalate tensions, while complying might set a precedent. For spies, this unpredictability was both dangerous and useful. Rules could be bent, bribed, or challenged depending on who was watching. Finally, authority in Soviet culture. Unlike Western systems, where authority is based on written laws and legal precedents, Soviet authority was about power, hierarchy, and ideology. Who was in the party hierarchy mattered more than the actual law. If you outranked someone, you had authority. Ideological loyalty was crucial. A class enemy might not be recognized at all. Plus, control of force, troops, or police meant your authority was real, even if technically illegal. This starkly contrasts with Western notions of legality and recognition, which rely more on written agreements. So in Berlin, you had this complex, layered world where rules could be both a shield and a weapon, and authority was deeply tied to power and loyalty. It really encapsulates how surreal and layered the Cold War environment was in that city. In practice, this meant that a Soviet officer at checkpoint Charlie could disregard an international treaty if Moscow or his commissar demanded it. Authority was performative and situational, not absolute. One of the oddest quirks of Cold War Berlin was how the Soviets refused to recognize West Berlin's ties to West Germany. If you showed a West German passport, East German border guards would reject it. So the Allies often used military ID cards instead, which the Soviets had to recognize under occupation law. This created some strange scenes where tourists, spies, and diplomats all argued over which piece of paper actually counted. Authority in this context wasn't just about laws. It was more about who could impose recognition at that moment. Now, this ambiguity created a perfect environment for spies. Double agents, in particular, thrived here. Imagine someone who was a Stasi informant one day, a CIA asset the next, and then under suspicion from both sides by the end of the week. Because Soviet and East German authority was so fluid, spies could easily play one system against another. A famous example of this is the tunnel operations in Berlin, like Operation Gold in the 1950s, where Western spies literally tapped into Soviet phone lines under East Berlin. When the Soviets uncovered it, they saw it as proof of Western aggression. Yet, in spy culture, it was just business as usual. In summary, the core idea is that the Soviets treated rules as flexible tools of control. Authority wasn't fixed or absolute. It was performative and context-dependent. Spies operated in this ambiguity, slipping through cracks where Western legalism clashed with Soviet power logic, making Berlin a real chessboard of covert operations and shifting authority. Now let's explore the psychological theater of Soviet rule. Authority there was never just about practical control. It was deeply symbolic, ritualized, and often suffocating, very Kafkaesque, with a layer of Nazi-style secret policing layered on top. Let's break this down to understand it better. First, rules as symbols, not just orders. In Soviet political culture, a rule wasn't simply a regulation to follow. It was a powerful symbol of the state's dominance. For example, being required to carry internal passports or stand in endless lines for bread wasn't just about logistics. It was about making you feel your dependence on the state. And these rules could change without warning. Today you could cross a certain street, tomorrow you couldn't, forcing you to internalize that only the state's whim truly matters. Next, Kafkaesque bureaucracy. Like in Kafka's novels, Soviet bureaucracy was labyrinthine and opaque. You needed forms to get forms, approvals from offices that might no longer even exist, and delays or denials that no one would explain. This absurdity wasn't just a flaw, it was a control mechanism. By making rules so confusing and impossible to fully understand, the state kept everyone in a state of constant vulnerability. Citizens internalized a kind of fatalism, thinking, if they want me guilty, I'm guilty, regardless of the actual facts. Then there's symbolic surveillance. The KGB and the Stasi didn't just spy, they wanted you to feel watched. Small symbols reinforced this feeling. Random ID checks on the street, secret police officers in plain clothes taking notes, neighbors suddenly disappearing. This echo of the Gestapo's methods created a climate of fear not just because surveillance was constant, but because it was unpredictable and symbolic. A knock on the door at 3 a.m. meant the state was watching, even in your sleep. Finally, public rituals of authority. Soviet culture was filled with symbolic displays of power, mass parades, official ceremonies, and controlled public spaces, all designed to reinforce the omnipresence of authority. These rituals weren't just about showing strength. They served as constant reminders that the power was embedded in every aspect of life. So, in summary, this psychological theater created a reality where authority was felt deeply, not just seen, shaping people's minds and behaviors in ways that went far beyond practical control. So essentially, Soviet rule transformed rules into powerful symbols of obedience. Bureaucracy became like Kafka's nightmare machine, an incomprehensible, intimidating system, and surveillance turned into a ritual of fear that everyone was expected to accept. Imagine living in a theater where the state is both the actor and the audience, and you're always on stage, whether anyone is watching or not. You could see this everywhere: parades in Red Square, giant portraits of Lenin looming over city blocks, ritual denunciations at workplaces or schools. These weren't just propaganda. They served as constant reminders that individual identity was secondary to the authority of the state. Even the smallest rules, standing properly in line, clapping at speeches, wearing the right pins, became tests of loyalty. Now, when we talk about rules in this context, it's important to understand that they blended fear and belief. Soviet authority didn't rely solely on secret police terror, like the Nazis did. Instead, it wrapped that terror in ideological symbols. For example, a bureaucrat denying your travel permit wouldn't just say no, but might tell you, "Comrade, your request does not align with the interests of socialist development." And here's the key point: the rule itself became a symbol of your moral alignment with the state. This dual layer, Kafka's absurd bureaucracy combined with Nazi-style fear, created an environment where people felt guilty and powerless, even if they hadn't done anything wrong. Now let's look at Berlin, especially in the divided city. The symbolic tactics were on full display there, too. At Checkpoint Charlie, East German guards made Westerners wait under the shadow of giant red flags and hammer and sickle emblems. Every ID check was more than just verifying documents. It was a ritual act of submission to the Soviet and East German authorities. And of course, the Berlin Wall itself was a pure symbol, concrete proof of control. It was a visible reminder that freedom was not something you could decide for yourself. It was taken away, reinforced by this powerful physical symbol of repression. This slide shows us the core through line of the Cold War, which is really about how the Soviet system evolved its machinery of symbols, psychology, and rules to maintain control at home, project power abroad, and keep up the appearance of legitimacy until its collapse in 1991. Let's walk that arc step by step. Starting with the Stalinist foundations of the 1940s and early 1950s, we see that terror was used as a key symbol. Stalin's USSR relied on show trials, purges, and a cult of personality to embody state power. Every banner of Stalin was more than just an image. It was a threat, a constant reminder that the leader is watching you. The rules were intentionally vague. Article 58 of the Soviet Penal Code, for example, could mean anything, turning laws into a trap from which escape was impossible. This created an environment where people learned to stay silent, conform, and use doublespeak. Private thoughts and public behavior often diverged, leading to a psychological split that became normalized in Soviet life. Moving into the Khrushchev era and the so-called Thaw of the mid-1950s to 1960s, we see a shift. Khrushchev denounced Stalin in 1956, which was like an earthquake, saying even the once godlike leader could be judged. This was a symbolic break, a message that the system was changing. Instead of constant terror, Khrushchev introduced positive symbols: Sputnik, Gagarin in space, the Corn Campaign, that projected progress and modernity. It was about showing the world a new, optimistic face of the USSR. Psychologically, the fear of purges eased somewhat, but the need for ideological conformity remained absolute. Dissent was no longer crushed with executions, but through exile, psychiatric abuse, or job loss, methods that felt more normalized. And there's a Kafkaesque twist here. The bureaucracy expanded into endless loops, permits, approvals, queues that created absurd obstacles. The rules still controlled you, but in a more bureaucratic, less overtly violent way. Then we arrive at the Brezhnev era, often called the period of stagnation from 1964 to 1982. During this time, symbolism became ritual. Parades, Lenin portraits, medals, these were hollow symbols performed more out of habit than belief. Everyone knew it was all a facade, but participation was still expected. Citizens developed what I'd call rule fatigue. They mastered the art of living double lives, obeying rules outwardly while subverting them privately, through black markets, samizdat literature, or kitchen table dissent. It was a survival strategy in a system that demanded conformity, but allowed for covert resistance. So, throughout this arc, we see a consistent pattern. The use of symbols, rules, and psychological tactics to maintain control, adapt to changing times, and sustain legitimacy, until the eventual collapse in 1991. On this slide, we're exploring the psychology behind cynicism in the late Cold War era. Instead of outright believing in the ideology, people began to feign belief, creating a kind of societal mask. This cynicism acted as a pressure valve, allowing individuals to express disillusionment without facing direct repression. Moving to the evolution of the KGB, their tactics shifted from mass purges to more surgical methods. They employed Zersitzung, or decomposition tactics, which involved subtle harassment aimed at destroying reputations, careers, and even family ties. This form of psychological warfare kept the population insecure and obedient, but without provoking large-scale backlash. Now, during the 1970s and 1980s, we see the era of symbol wars. Propaganda became the battleground, symbols of ideological conflict. On the Soviet side, we had peace movements, anti-nuclear campaigns, and Olympic pageantry, all designed to project strength and moral superiority. Meanwhile, the West countered with symbols of consumer culture, jeans, rock music, Coca-Cola, Hollywood, all undermining Soviet austerity and discipline. This created a psychological sense of envy among Soviet citizens. They saw the Western lifestyle on TV and magazines, and the stark contrast between official propaganda celebrating worker glory and the reality of empty store shelves became impossible to ignore. The Soviets also weaponized rules internationally. They selectively demanded recognition of East Germany or pushed peace treaties, but would violate agreements when it suited their interests. Here, rules served as flexible tools in the geopolitical game. Then we come to Gorbachev's era from 1985 to 1991. He introduced Glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, allowing people to criticize openly for the first time. This was a huge shift. The psychological impact was profound. After decades of fear and ritual, the rules suddenly changed. Censorship relaxed, forbidden books appeared, dissidents were released. People experienced both hope and disorientation because the familiar structures were collapsing. The Soviet Union's symbolic control was also cracking. The party thrived on symbols like Lenin, red flags, and May Day parades, but by the late 1980s, these symbols were being mocked, torn down, and replaced by chants for independence. The old symbols lost their power. Finally, the bureaucratic machinery, like the Kafkaesque secret police, dissolved under its own contradictions. The fear that kept compliance alive simply evaporated. The rules no longer held sway. What was once a psychological fortress turned into paper walls. The machinery of repression lost its grip, and the walls of control crumbled, revealing how fragile the regime's hold really was. So, by 1991, we see a dramatic shift in symbols from being sources of fear to signs of collapse. Take the August 1991 coup attempt, for example. Tanks rolled into Moscow, which was meant to be a show of strength for the coup plotters. But instead of intimidating the population, those tanks became symbols of weakness. Citizens climbed on them, and soldiers refused to follow orders, turning what was supposed to be a display of power into a visual emblem of the regime's fragility. And then, in December 1991, we have the final symbolic act, the lowering of the red flag over the Kremlin. It was replaced by the tricolor of the Russian Federation. That single gesture marked the end of the old rules, rituals, and psychological theater that had sustained the Soviet system for so long. It was a powerful visual cue signaling that the old order was finished. Now, the big picture here is that the Soviet Union's survival depended heavily on transforming rules into symbols, symbols into psychological tools, and ultimately, psychology into control. Over those 4 decades, we saw different phases. Stalin's era relied on terror symbols and Kafkaesque rules. Khrushchev brought an ideological spectacle. Brezhnev relied on hollow rituals paired with the psychology of the secret police. And Gorbachev's era saw the collapse of these symbols and rules altogether. When those symbols lost their meaning and the rules no longer instilled fear, the entire system started to unravel. That's the core idea. Without the symbols and the psychological control they fostered, the Soviet system couldn't hold itself together. It's a powerful reminder of how deeply symbols and psychological control are intertwined with political stability. The 1991 collapse of the Soviet Union didn't exactly mark the end of its power structures. In fact, it more accurately represents a transformation or mutation of them. The KGB men, black market networks, and party insiders didn't simply disappear. They rebranded themselves under capitalism's cover and carried their methods into the new Russian state. What appeared to be an opening, a move towards democracy and free markets, was, in many ways, just a mask for the consolidation of a mafia-style oligarchy. Let's break down this transition. First, the collapse as a cover, between 1991 and 1993. The West and many Russians saw this period as a moment of liberation, of breaking free from the old Soviet constraints. The media showed statues falling, flags changing, the opening of McDonald's on Pushkin Square, symbols of freedom and capitalism. But underneath that, the reality of power transfer was quite different. Those who controlled party resources, KGB intelligence networks, and black market smuggling kept their positions of leverage. They didn't lose power. They simply moved from state hierarchies into what appeared to be private businesses. Now, this chaos created a unique opportunity. Hyperinflation, rapid privatization, lawlessness. These conditions favored those with existing networks of violence, intelligence, or insider knowledge. These are exactly the skill sets of the Soviet elites, so they adapted quickly, consolidating their influence in the new environment. Moving on to privatization, which is often seen as a move toward free markets. The voucher privatization scheme under Yeltsin in the early 90s was supposed to give ordinary Russians a stake in the new economy, offering small paper shares in state industries. But in practice, insiders and criminal groups quickly bought up these vouchers, either with cash or even vodka bottles, allowing them to control key industries like oil, gas, aluminum, and banking. This led to the rise of a handful of oligarchs, many of whom were ex-Komsomol youth, party fixers, or embedded mafiosi rooted in the shadow economy. They didn't come out of nowhere. They rose from Soviet networks. Think of figures like Roman Abramovich, Boris Berezovsky, and Mikhail Khodorkovsky. They were products of the Soviet system, now operating in a privatized landscape. Finally, let's talk about the KGB and its successor agencies. Officially, the KGB was dissolved, but in reality, it splintered into agencies like the FSB, SVR, and GRU. Former KGB officers didn't disappear. They moved into security consulting, banking, and politics, often still tied to organized crime. They used compromat, blackmail files gathered during the Soviet era, as currency in the new order. So the secret police and intelligence apparatus didn't leave. They simply changed suits, started running banks, and engaged in business deals. The old methods persisted, but in a new guise. In essence, what looked like a break from the past was really a reconfiguration, where old power structures adapted, survived, and thrived under a new capitalist veneer. By the mid-1990s, Russia essentially became what we can call a mafia state. On the surface, it looked like a democracy, elections, political parties, a parliament. But in reality, power was maintained through bribery, threats, and even assassinations. It was a symbolic cover, hiding the true nature of how decisions were made. Western firms and banks were often dazzled by this facade, and they flowed Russian money into their systems, not realizing that much of it was stolen state wealth being laundered through offshore havens. This created a complex web where legality was secondary to influence and control. This context sets the stage for understanding how Putin and the consolidation of power in the 2000s further formalized this mafia state structure. So looking back at the 1990s from the West, it often seemed like transition chaos. It was a time of rapid change, uncertainty, and upheaval. To Russians themselves, it felt like a time of troubles, a period where only the strong could survive and navigate the chaos. But what's really fascinating is how insiders viewed this era. They saw it as the perfect camouflage. Behind the surface of freedom and reform, they were actually building a new kind of state. The key point to understand here is that the collapse of the USSR wasn't a clean break. It was more like a metamorphosis. The old Soviet system, its symbols, rules, and secret power structures didn't just disappear. Instead, they shifted into something new. They found a way to embed themselves into the language of markets and democracy. What this means is that Russia, in essence, became a mafia state under the cover of reform. The oligarchs didn't vanish. They simply adapted. They put on Western suits, bought Western assets, and continued to exert control, but now within a new framework. They carried Soviet-style influence into this new era, hiding behind the appearance of Western-style change. So, when we look at this period, it's crucial to see beyond the surface and understand how old power structures transformed and persisted under a new guise. The Soviet Union's ghost never really left behind. Even after 1991, its symbols, myths, and habits continue to seep into everyday life in Russia and the former republics. For many people, those times are remembered not just as dictatorship and scarcity, but as a period of certainty, strength, and belonging. So let's explore why that nostalgia still persists today. First, there's the myth of stability. The USSR projected itself as unshakable, offering jobs for life, affordable housing, predictable rations, and guaranteed education. Now, of course, the reality was often queues, shortages, and cramped apartments. But compared to the chaos of the 1990s, when wages vanished and the mafia ruled, many see the Soviet era as a time when the ground didn't move under their feet. For older generations, that period feels like a psychological anchor, something solid in an uncertain world, that disappeared after the system collapsed. Next, consider the symbols that never really died. Red flags, the hammer and sickle, Lenin statues. Many of these still stand in public spaces, in parades, and even in family photo albums. These symbols carry deep emotional weight. They're tied to moments of victory in WWII, the launch of Sputnik, Gagarin's historic flight, Olympic gold medals. Pride in those achievements often outlives the system itself. Interestingly, the state actively cultivates this nostalgia. Victory Day parades today still use imagery almost identical to that of the Brezhnev era, recycling the past as a way to legitimize the present. Then there's the psychology of belonging. In the USSR, people's identities were often embedded in something larger, the Soviet people. After 1991, that collective sense of belonging shattered. Ethnic tensions resurfaced, republics broke away, poverty spread. People felt more isolated than ever, lost in the marketplace. Nostalgia, in part, is about missing that sense of being part of something grand, a superpower, a collective identity that gave life meaning. Finally, rules as comfort. As strict and suffocating as Soviet regulations could be, they were also predictable. Life had a certain order. But after the collapse, that order was replaced with wild uncertainty, inflation, gangsters, corrupt cops, oligarchs flaunting their wealth. The chaos created a feeling of insecurity. So many cling to the past, where rules, however harsh, offered stability and certainty amidst the chaos of the post-Soviet transition. All of these factors, stability, symbols, belonging, and rules, help explain why the nostalgia for the Soviet era still lingers today, even decades after its end. Many people remember Soviet bureaucracy with a certain ironic fondness. They say, "At least I knew what stamp I needed, who to bribe, and how to survive." It's a strange kind of comfort in knowing the rules, even if they were arbitrary. But when we look at the post-Soviet capitalism that followed, It felt much more unpredictable and, frankly, more dangerous than Kafka's old rules. The arbitrariness of the new system created a sense of chaos that many found unsettling. Now, if we talk about economic memory, under socialism, basic goods were often cheap or subsidized, which made life more predictable. But after the collapse, poverty skyrocketed, savings disappeared, and inequality exploded. For millions who lost pensions or jobs in the 1990s, the Soviet past seemed like a time of relative dignity, even if it was modest by Western standards. It's important to see that nostalgia isn't just about the past, it's about the comfort of stability and security. When we turn to cultural legacy, we see that films, music, and literature from the Soviet era still serve as cultural touchstones. Families continue to share stories of WWII heroism, Soviet sports triumphs, and the space race. These memories create a shared sense of identity, binding generations together. Even for those born after the Soviet Union's fall, these stories have become a kind of cultural mythos, an enduring narrative that shapes their understanding of history and identity. Now, leaders like Vladimir Putin have skillfully harnessed this nostalgia for political ends. By invoking Soviet symbols, the red banner on Victory Day, the Soviet melody in the national anthem, they tap into deep emotional currents of pride and a desire for stability. Nostalgia becomes a political currency, reminding people that Russia was once feared, respected, and considered great. It's about reactivating a sense of national pride. So, in summary, Soviet nostalgia isn't really about loving shortages or censorship. It's about longing for stability instead of chaos, pride instead of humiliation, and a sense of belonging instead of atomized struggle. The Soviet Union is like a phantom limb, amputated, but still felt, still aching, and still shaping how people remember their past. Its legacy persists because it offers a story of who people once were, and for many, who they still hope to become again. This slide doesn't contain enough information. That's why we're moving to the next slide.